So our brain is only about 20 or 25% of the size of the adult brain at birth. That means that relatively, our brain is so much more immature than any other animal. Most of the rest of brains develop in the womb in a controlled setting. But the human brain, most of it, almost 80% of it, happens outside of the womb in an uncontrolled setting.
To all our listeners, welcome to Super Daddy Club podcast. Today we have a very exciting guest, Dr. Robert Melillo. If I can start by providing our guest here with a little brief introduction for you guys to get familiar. Dr. Robert Melillo is a world-renowned expert in brain health, specializing in childhood and adult neurological disorders. A clinician, professor, brain researcher, and best-selling author of Disconnected Kids. He focuses on ADHD, autism, OCD, tics, anxiety, and other developmental issues. Dr. Melillo is dedicated to bridging brain function, behavior, and physical health. His innovative multimodal approach, the Melillo Method, has transformed thousands of lives. Thank you all for being here. And Doctor, welcome to Super Daddy Club podcast.
Thank you, Lindo. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I ended up getting both books, Disconnected and Connected. But to get us started here, can you take us through how exactly did this here become your specialty or your area of focus? What were you seeing at the time, at least? Because you've been in this for 30 years or more. And so can you just take us through a little bit of the evolution of your journey where you start finding that, hey, this is something that I need to focus on?
Sure. Just a quick note, the book you held up, that's the second edition. The third edition just came out a few months ago, and it's much more updated with information.
Okay.
So, and it's got a different cover on it. But for me, getting into healthcare, I was an athlete when I was younger and played a lot of sports, my brother and I. With that comes a lot of injuries. And I always found that, I was interested in what was happening. So I got interested in health and exercise and diet and nutrition early on. When I was in high school, I fell in love with anatomy and physiology. And just based on what had helped me, I was really more into a natural approach. So when I decided where I was going to go, I knew I wanted to go into healthcare. Between medicine and something else, I chose to go to chiropractic school because I felt that it fit more with me and they'd always helped me the most. When I was there, I fell in love with neurology and rehabilitation, which is a huge part of chiropractic. And then when I came out, I went into a subspecialty board certification in neurology and rehabilitation. And so early on, I then started also teaching. I became a postgraduate professor of neurology and rehabilitation and was involved in some research. So in the first 10 years of my practice, I had created a pretty advanced rehab center that was really dealing with very complex neurological issues. But then I had some people in my family and friends had come up to me asking me questions about their kids that had ADHD and autism. And I was seeing, as everybody was, this kind of epidemic rise of these neurological issues in children. And then my own son was labeled with ADHD. And the first question to me was, well, what is it? What's actually happening in the brain? Because I already knew a lot about neurology and the brain, and I was looking into brain research, but I didn't really know what ADHD was or what autism was. And so I went around and wanted to speak to some of my colleagues that I thought would know, like pediatric neurologists or pediatricians or neurologists or psychologists or psychiatrists. And none of them really had an answer. They all basically said the same thing. I don't really know what the problem is, but they were all very sure that you couldn't do anything about it. So as a father and as a clinician, to me, that didn't make sense. And so I decided to really do the research myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I dove into the research, and then I started connecting with some top researchers around the world and started finding out what it was or what the thinking was at the time. And I just started compiling a lot of research. And then I started experimenting with different approaches in my own son and other kids. And we started getting results right from the beginning. And after 10 years, I felt like I really understood what was happening. I wrote my first textbook, Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood and Evolutionary Perspective. And that was a big hit right from the beginning. And then it went from there. I just never stopped doing it, researching it, writing papers, getting different degrees, understanding what's happening in the brain. And even to this day.
Now, 30 years ago when you got in, was it already considered an epidemic at that point, or was it still rising or just becoming more common? Because I'm curious as to the evolution of the conversation with this condition here. Today, there's a lot of information. I feel like the giants at the top of the hill have, different approaches, a lot of disagreements, but I'm like, was the conversation always this polarizing? Was it always this hard to figure out what was going on? And so if you can just take us through, I know you touched based on it there, just saying that early on, some of the people that you went to did not understand what was going on, what was causing this, or why the rise was occurring. And so how have you seen the conversation evolve over time?
Well, that's a good question. And so just in regard to ADHD, when we look at, in the early 90s, I remember in 1995 is when I really started looking at this. And I remember driving to my office, and there was a statistic on the radio that said between 1990 and 1995, there was a 250% increase in the use of Ritalin in the United States. And that was a drug that was really used for ADHD at the time. And they could not explain why that was. So right there, I kind of, as I started getting involved, we started seeing the very beginning of the epidemic, the very beginning of these issues, which really kind of started to increase in the 80s, but really started to spike in the early 90s and since then. And so looking at that, I think that's where in the beginning, a lot of people weren't really seeing that there was a sharp increase. There was an increase, but nobody knew why. And of course, at first, everybody believed, well, they're just being diagnosed more. And it's just a way of giving out more drugs. But was that actually the case or not? I went to teachers and I said, I see that there's this dramatic increase in giving Ritalin and ADHD. I said, are there actually more kids? I mean, is it really a problem? And I remember I had this fourth grade teacher that was a friend of my family that had been a teacher for about 30 years. And she said to me, oh, you have no idea how much of a problem this is. Like, no, this isn't just we're recognizing it. This is like we're seeing so many kids. And she sent me to a book called Endangered Minds, which was written by a woman named Jane Healy, who was a PhD principal of a school and an educator. And that was in the early 90s, I think 92, 93. And in that book, she said that there was a dramatic increase in kids in the classroom and that there was a dramatic change that just had started happening over the past 5 or 10 years. And that kids' brains were different and kids were different. And she was speculating as to why that was the case. And she kind of made an argument in that book. So right from that time, people were saying, no, it isn't just we're recognizing it. There are actually more kids. And now when you look at something like autism, which is actually even more obvious in most cases and even easier to diagnose, you see that same argument where people are saying, no, we're just recognizing it more. But if you go speak to educators or people in the school system, same thing. They'll say to you, oh my God, no, there are so many more kids that have these issues that it's overwhelming.
And just to help me understand, so the idea that we're diagnosing more, are they saying that our methods of diagnosis have changed and evolved so much that we're starting to pick up more of it? But then the educators and the people in the field are saying it's not just that we're just picking up more of it because we're actually seeing more of it in the classroom, even more symptoms of it, more presentations of it. And so we're actually grappling with a rise in this issue here, and it's happening to more and more kids.
Yeah. So part of it is that there has been a much greater increase awareness. There's definitely better diagnostics on making the diagnosis. It may be more clear. There's been a change in diagnosis of categorization where kids down the road, somewhere years ago might have been diagnosed with something different than what than autism. And now it's maybe all kind of more under autism. And so, all of those things are somewhat true.
Mm-hmm.
In my third book, which is called Autism, the Scientific Truth, and where I really addressed all of these things, and that came out in 2013. It was the first book really talking about what was really driving these issues, and was there a possible prevention for it, or
Mm-hmm.
could we lower the risk of it? And it was really the first book written of that. It was pretty extensive, and I researched it for a while. And the research that I had read at the time and some epidemiologists, the idea was that maybe 50%, maybe more, but anywhere between 40 to 60% could be explained through better recognition, better diagnosis, changes in diagnostic criteria, giving different
Mm-hmm.
diagnoses. All of those things together, if you looked at all of them, clustering, where people cluster in different areas, all of that explained maybe 50 to 60%, which means that 40 to 50% didn't fit any of that rationale, meaning that that was new cases that never existed before. And I believe that's the case now. I believe that of the increase going from 1 in 10,000 in the 70s to now 1 in 31, of that increase, about 50% of it is because we're better at recognizing it and we're noticing it earlier, and we're doing better job in maybe different communities. And all of that is 50%. That means, what about the other 50%? How do you explain that? To me, you can only explain it by there's actually more cases. There's what we call prevalence versus incidence. Prevalence is the statistics that the CDC comes out with.
Mm-hmm.
Incidence means what's the actual increase in new cases that didn't exist before. And I believe both prevalence and incidence is increasing at dramatic levels, at epidemic levels.
So, and thank you for that, because the 50 to 60% that is, with better diagnostic methods is significant. But again, the other 50%, what is our understanding of that? Because that's where I feel like there's a lot of quarrel. So growing up, when I first started hearing about autism, it was through the debate of, it was pertaining to the other 50%, which were initially like, hey, are vaccines causing the rise in autism? Is it the food that the people are eating? Is it the forever chemicals that we're finding everywhere and we're finding more of? I mean, all those things, I feel like we're really struggling to find a consensus even amongst the profession and the people who are studying and researching this. So can you take us through the environmental factors, or what are the main culprit that we're seeing that will be able to explain the other 50% to the best of our understanding today, at least?
Yeah. So, I research this. So I have my research, my lab, and what I feel very strongly about that our research shows. And then there are obviously other people, and they do their research and they have their opinion. But, first of all, Linda, when you want to talk about causation or you want to talk about treatments, you can't really do that unless you really understand what the problem is. And this is where I think the problem really is, and it still exists today, and it has always existed. There are virtually very few people out there that have any idea what is actually happening in the brain of someone with autism or ADHD or dyslexia or schizophrenia or bipolar, any sort of neurological and especially developmental issues. That's where I've really focused. Like I said, my first question was, well, what's happening in my son's brain? That's
Mm-hmm.
all I want to know, because then I can't know how to change it, or if I can change it, if I don't know what it is. So I've
Mm-hmm.
really looked at that from an extensive level in what we call functional neurology, or functional neuroscience. And there aren't a lot of people that look at it that way. The traditional neurologists, they look for what we call organic neurological disease, meaning they're looking for things that are obvious: brain injury, tumors, some sort of genetic mutation that they can see, anything like that, that is something that have a brain infection, encephalitis. Those are the things that they can see, they can measure, they can look at an MRI or a blood test and they'll see it. Something like autism doesn't fit any of that. There's no brain injury. If you do an
Mm-hmm.
MRI, it looks relatively normal. Their blood tests look relatively normal with subtle differences in certain things.
Mhm.
But the fact is, there's no infection, there's no genetic mutation per se, there's no brain injury. So, okay, what's the problem? Because even in kids with severe non speaking autism, which is really my main specialty, you won't see anything different in their brain. Most of those kids don't have any genetic mutations. They've been through a battery of genetic tests. They all come up negative for the most part. So, what's the problem? The problem has to do with what we call functional connectivity and the way the brain grows, develops, and connects, the way we form networks, the way those networks communicate with one another. And that's where the problem lies. And very, very few people understand that. And the problem is that most clinicians that are doctors that are out there treating people, they don't know the research. They don't do research. They may not even read a lot of the research. Then you get researchers that are doing the research, but if they're just a researcher, they're not a clinician, and they may not really interact with a lot of patients. They may not see, like the typical neuroscientist doesn't really deal with people. They deal with computer models, right? So they come up with these computer simulations or models, or they're in the lab looking at things, and they're not really applying it. So there aren't a lot of people that have the breadth of knowledge, I think, to really understand the totality that something like autism, there's a functional imbalance that develops in the brain. It disrupts normal connectivity and normal function. That brain developmental issue affects the way the brain is going to regulate the body and the balance of what we call the sympathetic and parasympathetic, the inflammatory and anti-inflammatory systems, the detox systems, the gut, everything about what's happening. We wrote a paper in 2009 explaining all of this, basically saying that you could look at all the biomedical issues that people look at, like
Mhm.
leaky gut and inflammation in the body and food sensitivities and B12 deficiency and methylation problems and sulfation problems. We looked at all of them, and you could explain all of them by imbalances in development in the brain and in the brainstem and in the hemispheres, and in the imbalance that creates in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And that would explain it all, meaning that's a universal theory of autism that explains where symptoms are overactive or when they have savant level skills, when they have severely deficient skills. How do you explain all of this? You can't explain that just in metabolic terms. You can't explain it just by toxins hitting the brain.
Mhm.
It's much more complex than that. So there's a combination of genetics, the way the brain grows, primarily what we call epigenetics, meaning the environmental influences on the growth of the brain. Now, 84% of the genes that we have in the human brain are active during brain development, meaning that almost all of our genes that we have play a role in brain development. So they are the most prevalent genes we have. They also, by the nature of the way the human brain grows, they're the most sensitive genes we have. So that environmental influences alter gene expression. And the most common genes are the ones that have to do with brain growth and development. And most of human brain growth and development, 75 to 80% of it, happens outside the womb, which no other animal has to contend with. And so therefore, we can alter the trajectory of the growth of development in the brain, and that's superimposed on natural strengths and weaknesses. And this creates imbalances where we have areas of the brain that are overactive and areas that are underactive. And that comes together in various ways and produces different types of conditions like autism, ADHD, OCD, dyslexia, depending on that. That's
Mhm.
the way I look at it. That's the way our research shows it. And there are very few people that really understand, how the brain really functions, how it interacts with the body. And that's where I think the disconnect is coming.
Mhm. I like how it goes back to early brain development because there's so much that we've been finding out that goes on there that I think there's been a lot of breakthrough in that area just based on what we're finding with early brain development. And so when it came to ADHD, for example, and it touches based on what you were saying earlier, we learned on this platform that you can't necessarily pinpoint this is this particular area of the brain that is causing ADHD to take place, because ADHD is, from what we understood, was a conglomerate of symptoms that are emanating from different areas of the brain. And so there's not one specific thing. And just with our understanding, if that is accurate, is autism similar based on, is autism similar in that way too, where you have different areas of the brain that are presenting different types of symptoms that are hard to just pinpoint as to this is the one thing that's happening? Which brings us to the importance of going back to the early development and see, okay, well, what's going on here in a healthy brain versus an unhealthy brain? And I was very shocked to also hear that it's not so much the genes themselves, like epigenetic changes that occur after may affect it, but how do they correlate? How do they intersect? If you can expand on that a little bit more.
Sure. Brain development is really the key here. And again, whether it's prenatal or postnatal or even preconception, because many of the epigenetic factors are preconception factors, meaning in my book, what we showed was environmental factors can alter the expression of the genes in the adult, and they can cause epigenetic changes that can be passed on to multiple generations, even though they may not impact the individual themselves. But then they're superimposed on traits. So like, for instance, with autism, Simon Baron-Cohen out of Cambridge in the 90s showed that in families of people with autism, there were a much higher incidence of people that were engineers, physicists, and mathematicians. Also, he later showed that people that were in the finance world had a pretty high prevalence. But more recently, he showed that especially in the IT industry, that anywhere in the world there was a cluster of people that worked in the IT industry, there was a dramatic increase in autism in those communities, like Silicon Valley was number one in the world. And even when you looked at a country like Holland or Netherlands, and there were three major cities that he looked at, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and Eindhoven. All three of those demographically are almost identical. But the only difference is that Eindhoven is like Silicon Valley in Holland. And so they have a higher concentration of people that are like software engineers. And in that area, there was a much higher incidence of autism than in the rest of the communities. So what is that? So all those jobs, what do they favor? So for me, it's a specific cognitive style, which is what I refer to as a left brain dominant style. These are people that have like an engineering type of brain. They're really good in math and numbers and details. And they may struggle a little bit socially because their right brain may not be as strong. And to me, that's the trait that we see in the families that we work with. It's in the family, whether it's the parents or the grandparents. There's somebody in that family that has that kind of brain. If you get two parents together, like both work in software engineering or both are accountants or, then what you see is that that trait is even stronger in the child. And so that's one of the factors. That's a genetic factor, but it's not a genetic mutation. It's a genetic trait. And we know that traits can get stronger. And if they get too strong, now it becomes a disadvantage. So that's one factor. But then you look at other epigenetic factors that can alter gene expression, as we said. But, I have also a degree in clinical rehabilitation neuropsychology, and I have a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience because I wanted to understand all of this at the deepest level. And the bottom line is right now, I think, in psychology, most people would agree that 90% of even most adult mental health issues really start in childhood. It's all about how the brain grows and develops. And going back to the origin, that's why my first book was from an evolutionary perspective, meaning because we wanted to go back to where did brains start? Where did they come from to begin with? How did brains evolve? How does a brain develop? They mirror one another. The evolution of the brain throughout species and the evolution of our brain in development is almost identical. So what we know is the human brain is unique in many ways, but one way is that we have the biggest brain per body size of any primate, but because we're the only primates that stand up, we have the smallest birth canal. So right from the beginning, the human brain and human birth is unique and different and more dangerous than any other animal. So there are also these reflexes that we're born with where a baby will automatically at a certain age get into the right position upside down and backwards in the birth canal. They should do that without the cord getting wrapped around their neck. They should be deep enough down in the birth canal that they induce labor. And then during the birth process, these reflexes are used to help them get themselves out so that a baby shouldn't really need to be touched or helped. If they're not in the right position, if they have the cord wrapped around their neck, if they're not deep enough down, if the mom needs to be induced, if they're in a breech position, right off the bat, we have to say why. And for me, one of my areas that I look at is what's called primitive reflexes or neonatal reflexes. And it's about movement. We know that the reason why we have brains on this planet was because a living thing moved. Living things that don't move don't need a brain.
Mm-hmm.
Movement requires a brain, and movement is what develops our brains as humans. And so what we see is that anything that alters movement or our ability to move has a huge impact on brain development, even before birth and during birth. But as I said, the human brain, because we have to find a way to keep our brain very restricted in the womb so it doesn't grow too fast, otherwise it wouldn't get out. So our brain is only about 20 or 25% of the size of the adult brain at birth. That means that relatively, our brain is so much more immature than any other animal. Most of the rest of brains develop in the womb in a controlled setting. But the human brain, most of it, almost 80% of it, happens outside of the womb in an uncontrolled setting.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens during that first year and first couple of years has a huge impact on what's going to happen with our brain lifelong.
Mm-hmm.
And the right hemisphere is taking the lead in the first 2 to 3 years, and then the left hemisphere, and that creates a difference. And how our brain lateralizes, that's also unique to humans. And to make sure that that's happening in a full extent, and then how the brain connects and how networks form. And the way I look at everything is from a neuroanatomy, neuroscience perspective. Like, for instance, in autism, we see that there are overactivity of networks in the left hemisphere. And so when we look at something like tics or stimming behavior or hyperactivity in ADHD, that primarily comes from overactivity of an area called Brodmann area 6, or the supplemental motor area that connects to an area called the basal ganglia through something called the direct pathway. The other side of the brain is underdeveloped, and that's why this side is overdeveloped, because that other side actually controls what's called the hyperdirect pathway, which is inhibitory. So normally that would develop first, and it would inhibit the other side as it comes online, and it would control it. OCD comes from areas in the front of the brain, the dorsolateral and orbital frontal cortexes, overactive on the left, underdeveloped or immature on the right. So I can go through all of this, and we could talk about specific networks. And when you put that all together, then we label it as ADHD or autism or something. But there are specific areas of the brain that are out of balance with one another. And it's mostly because of a developmental imbalance. And all of that is something that we can typically change, but you can't explain that just through like chemicals. It's more complex than that.
Mm-hmm. You know, I found that fascinating because learning evolutionary biology, the first organism that developed movement were the foundation of more complex organisms.
Right.
And so it's kind of funny because it seems as though the brain follows that same path of development where we have this certain hierarchy, which you talk about there in the book. So the lower levels hierarchy or functions allow us to build more complex levels of skills. And well, I found that fascinating. But then you also describe the dance that goes in between the left and right brain hemisphere as it's developing, and how an event that is happening on one side is paramount for something else to be able to develop on the other side. And if that does not take place, then that is the imbalance you're talking about there.
Yeah. So as we said, the fact that our brains are lateralized and that we have a brain asymmetry is unique to humans from a standpoint that we published a paper 2 years ago in A Brain Called Symmetry, that where we went back and we showed that brain asymmetry could be already identified 250 to 500 million years ago in the fossil record. So trilobites, you studied evolutionary biology, you know this well, right? Trilobites in the fossil record, what they see is that whatever predator was preying on them with some sort of claws, they were only on the right side of the trilobite, which means that there was some sort of handedness or lateralization of the predators that were attacking them, which means that right from even then, whatever brains were there was a lateralization of function.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that that's the norm. And as you said, simple movement, simple brain, complex movement, complex brain. But as we get more and more complex, we also get more lateralization, more brain asymmetry. The more asymmetric, the more different the right and left hemisphere is, the more complex the brain is. And humans have the most complex brain, obviously. We also have the most complex movement. The most complex movement ever achieved has been bipedalism. And then even more complex than that is speech.
Yes.
So those two things are all linked together and unique to humans, and so is our lateralization. So the way that happens, the idea that it starts first with the right brain and then the left brain, and then by the end of 6 years, the two sides of the brain should be, pretty equivalent, and they should be integrated, and they should be relatively balanced so that sometimes they cooperate, they work together, and they do opposite things. So like the left brain is going to focus on words and hearing words. The right brain is going to focus on tone of voice or facial expression or gestures. And both of them come together to give us communication. But then sometimes we want to only focus on the words and we want to really concentrate on that. And we're not interested in those other things. So we need to shut that down so that it doesn't interfere.
Mm-hmm.
The hemispheres with the corpus callosum and other things, sometimes the brain cooperates and sometimes they're in competition, but there should be this natural flow and balance that's always there, where things come in mainly through the right brain, flow to the left, and then flow back to the right. And they each contribute differently to the overall perception of what's going on, and they regulate things. If there's anything developmentally that alters this trajectory and alters the growth of the right or the left, if the left comes on too early and gains dominance over the right, if any one of them gains too much of a competitive advantage, it shuts down the other side. And then it reduces that flow. And then we get that one side is accentuated and we may get too much of that. And the other side is decreased and we get too little of that. And that together is where I think most symptoms come from.
Now, back to the primitive reflexes. I wasn't too clear as to whether we're to keep or lose them. My understanding is we're supposed to have them up until a certain age. And if we keep some of these reflexes on after, and correct me here, if they continue after, if they persist, then there's signs of developmental delays or there's signs of problem. Can you just clarify as to whether, or at least when we're supposed to shed these reflexes, if we're supposed to shed them, and what does that mean for the brain development whenever we see these reflexes where we're not supposed to see them or when they're lacking altogether?
Right. And they're good questions. And this is the questions that really drove a lot of my PhD work. And we published in 2023, I think 8 papers on this. We just came out with another paper about 2 weeks ago in a major pediatric clinical journal, basically looking at retained primitive reflexes as an early biomarker of neurodevelopmental delays like autism. So maybe the earliest and most accurate biomarker. So primitive reflexes or neonatal reflexes are these reflexes that we're all born with. Why do they have them? Why are they so important? Well, as we said, the human brain is very small when we're born. So the genes that regulate brain development are really what we call experience-dependent genes, and they're really bombarded when we get outside the womb by sensory input. So light, sound, temperature, gravity, all of that hits the genes and basically turns them on and now gets our brain to grow. But all of that is really driven by movement. A baby needs to move to be able to engage the world, engage their senses, calibrate their brain to the world around them, and build the brain and turn on the genes. The problem is the motor cortex in humans isn't there when we're born. A horse will be able to run in less than 2 hours after being born. We won't walk until 12 months. In the best case scenario. It just goes to show you how immature, but we don't have control over movement, but yet we need to move to be able to get our brain to grow. This is why these primitive reflexes are so important, because they allow us to do basic programmed, simple movements that allow a baby to do things like root and suck and feed themselves, but also get in the right position in the womb, get out of the womb, roll over, and start to move and interact and do things that engage the world in more and more complex ways, building a more and more complex brain. And they should lead us through the first year. And then right around the end of the first year, 11 to 13 months in my window, every child should be able to walk a few steps independently, talk a few words, 3 to 5, and they should point and have good eye contact and smile and have nonverbal communication. And then at that point, the reflexes are gone. They're fully integrated. And now it allows for much more complex movement, because the primitive reflexes only allow for very simplistic movements. And as we said, you can't build a complex brain with simple movements. So we need to get rid of these reflexes to allow the child to now run and jump and do things and really interact in a much more gross motor, fine motor way that builds a more complex brain, and ultimately then precursors of cognitive abilities emerge into the brain and grow out. And then once that grows, now we can actually learn in a typical way. But if these reflexes don't come on fully, like if a baby can't latch on and root and suck, like 90% of the kids we work with non-speaking autism, they couldn't latch on initially. What does that mean? It means the rooting and sucking reflex isn't there. It's not coming out, which means to me that the genes that regulate the gene expression of the brain are delayed, and that epigenetic factors are affecting the expression of those genes, not damaging them, not causing a mutation, but just delaying maybe the onset or the expression of those genes. And the right brain is developing first, so that may be impacted more. So then the reflexes aren't coming on when they're supposed to. They don't hit that milestone, and then they're late for the next milestone. And then they're late for the next milestone, or they may skip over the milestone. And it gets more and more and more and more, and the brain becomes more and more off track. And then what may happen, what I believe happens, and what I think our research has shown, is like something like autism. If the reflexes don't go away by one, then what happens is now the reflexes hold back the brain and they keep it in an immature state. And we've seen this in our research. And then we see these reflexes are retained. If they're there beyond one, they're what's considered retained reflexes. And that is a sign that the brain is still very immature. And then that immaturity can lead to an imbalance, because the right brain should be at its peak of development. But now if it's held back, the right brain should be suppressing that left brain a little bit. But now it loses that. And now if this child is really gifted in their left brain, where they have a trait where their left brain is naturally very strong, it comes online too early. And now it pushes that right brain down. And that's where the regression comes from, I believe. And that happens, a lot of it happens right around the time when kids are getting vaccinated. And so, okay, what do we blame? We're automatically going to blame the vaccine. Although we do know that, the regulation of the inflammatory and anti-inflammatory system is also in that same brainstem area where all the reflexes come from. So these kids are in a more inflamed state. They usually have what we call a Th2 dominance, which means they're producing antibodies too easily. And now you give them a vaccine, that is designed to trigger antibodies, and that triggers inflammation. And now you may trigger this massive increase in inflammation. And I believe it might be like pouring gasoline on a fire, and it may make that regression even worse. And all of this comes together, I think, in a perfect storm. And that's what I believe is happening.
That was very important. If we can go back just a little bit, because I had a question about what is the role of inflammation and the immune system in the development or occurrence of these disorders. And what you're explaining there, if I heard correctly, is that there is already the development of the immune system that is occurring at a certain stage. What is that initial inflammation or engagement of the immune system within these conditions here? Where does it kick in?
Sure. So we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is basically the fight or flight. It's there really to sense when we're in danger. The parasympathetic, called the rest and digest, and it's there when we're in safety. When we're in danger, our heart rate goes up, our pupils get big, our ears get loud, and our gut shuts down. When we're in safety, we can relax, we can digest food, we can sleep, and we become more social.
Mm-hmm.
So those two, balances are very, very important. And the basis of it is in the lower part of the brainstem called the medulla and the pons, where all the reflexes come from. And that is what develops first. And so that area needs to be fully mature. When we're born, our sympathetic nervous system and the nuclei that regulates that in the medulla is on. The nuclei that regulates our gut function, called our dorsal motor nucleus, is being shut down by that nucleus. So it's there, but it's not operating. And when we're born in a sympathetically dominant state for a reason. One is we need the gut to be open and leaky when we're born. People talk about leaky gut and how these kids get leaky gut. We're born with a leaky gut. We all have a leaky gut when we're born. That's the way it's supposed to be. The reason for that is that babies don't have an adaptive immune system yet, so they don't produce antibodies. They need to get their antibodies from the mother's breast milk. They initially get the antibodies through the placenta in the womb, primarily IgG antibodies, but then when they're born, they need to get it through the breast milk. These are large immunoglobulin proteins. They wouldn't get through a normal, closed up, mature, tight stomach lining, so the gut is open and leaky. The sympathetic nervous system shuts down the production of acid and enzymes, again, for a good reason. One is we really don't need it at that point, but also the acid and the enzymes would destroy those antibodies in the gut. The other is we don't have a lot of blood flow to our gut and we don't have a lot of movement. All of that's being shut down by the sympathetic nervous system. As the child goes through the first year and is hitting these milestones, as their brain is maturing, as they start to actually ingest solid food, and as they start to produce their own antibodies, another nucleus called the nucleus ambiguus, which is the parasympathetic nucleus, comes online and it starts to shut down the sympathetic nuclei and activate the dorsal motor nucleus, which turns on our gut functions. And now the gut starts to close up. Now we start to produce acid and enzymes that breaks down the food. It also creates a proper environment for good bacteria to grow, bad bacteria, yeast, fungus, mold, parasites. None of that should be able to live in our gut. The acid should kill it. Mm-hmm. We see a lot of kids that we work with, they have all these things. They have dysbiosis. Why? Because their sympathetic nervous system is still on and they're not having the right acid. Then we see that what should happen is increased blood flow so we can absorb nutrients and vitamins and amino acids, and we start to get movement so we're not constipated. Mm-hmm. What we know is happening, we've shown this, is that the parasympathetic is not coming on in autism and most developmental issues. They stay in a sympathetically dominant state. And we also know that that is because the primitive reflexes aren't going away. The brainstem isn't maturing, so it's staying, the sympathetic nervous system stays dominant. Mm-hmm. And so they have a leaky gut. They have poor digestion. They're not producing enzymes and acids. They're not breaking down food. They have malabsorption. They have vitamin and mineral issues. They have gut dysbiosis. They get inflammation in the gut. And also, when we look at inflammation or anti-inflammation, that's also regulated by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So we know that the sympathetic nervous system and the left hemisphere is primarily promotes inflammation and inflammatory cytokines. The right hemisphere and the parasympathetic is mostly anti-inflammatory. So we know that these kids, because they're in a sympathetically dominant state and their left brain is dominant, they are in a more inflamed state. They have what we call a Th2 dominance, and that produces Th17 or Th9 or Th23, and that produces inflammation. And so they're in a chronically inflamed state. But all of this, and we hear people say, well, it all starts in the gut. It all starts with inflammation, and that creates autism. That's not how it works. It starts in the brainstem. It starts with lack of brain maturation and developmental delays, these retained reflexes. And then that is what alters the balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic, and that affects the gut. And that affects all of the things associated with leaky gut. That affects an overactive immune system with inflammation, overactive antibodies, which develop antibodies against foods and other things. That's where it all starts to me.
So some of these children will be better off if they didn't get vaccinated at certain ages, because we're risking, like you're saying, there's like throwing fuel to a fire already, or something that is occurring where their left brain dominant, their sympathetic system is dominant, their immune system is hyperactive, we can say that already.
Yep.
And then we initiate a cascade of inflammation, and that just worsens their condition.
Exactly. So you look at it, and Lendo, I know this is very controversial, and I know that there are parents that absolutely believe in there is such a thing as vaccine injury, but it's fairly rare. But the point is that if vaccines themselves caused autism, then anyone who was ever vaccinated would have autism, right? But that's not the case. And anybody, even the staunchest people in the vaccine injury world, will say that, well, yeah, I recognize that, but there's something else. And what is that something else? Many of them say, well, they can't methylate, or they have the MTHFR gene. And then they point at other things. But all of it leads to the fact that the immune system is overactive, that they're already in an inflamed state.
Mm-hmm.
So what's causing that? To me, it's happening from the brain and the brainstem, and this imbalance. That's the cause. That's the thing that predisposes some children to have maybe an over-inflammatory response. But I've seen also many, many children go through the exact same regression who have never been vaccinated. I've worked with many people in the Amish community and in the Mennonite community who have never been vaccinated and have gone through the same regression, because the main driver of that is this imbalance that develops, and that is the main thing that separates it. But then they are in a more inflamed state. They do have more sensitive antibodies. And now what is a vaccine designed to do? It's designed to trigger antibodies.
Mm-hmm.
And now if you trigger antibodies in an already overactive inflamed system, you create much more inflammation. And obviously that can really make things much worse.
Wow. You've done some phenomenal things here in connecting the dots, particularly as to why developmental milestones are so important.
And they are.
Sometimes I feel like this is how you get men to the conversation, because this is the kind of stuff that we're like, oh yeah, that's interesting.
Yep.
But developmental milestones are very important, and I understand why. There's a point in time where the scientists did not see the development of the brain and the development of the body as being connected. They looked at them separately, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak of that? Because it's kind of strange, because you hear Eastern tradition, Buddhist monks say the body and the mind are one thing, and it's like, okay, great. But there's a point in time where we didn't believe that they developed together. We looked at them separately. Is that?
Yeah, I think that.
Am I describing that accurately?
Yeah, I think that had a lot to do with religion and Christianity, and where we believe that God just gave us this intellect, right? That we were born, that God created us. There was no such thing as evolution. and that we were just born and we were given this intellect and we were different from the animals of the earth, that we didn't share any similar traits. We were special. And so therefore, to think of just the body or the motor, to think that, the way we move had an impact on our brain was almost blasphemous. The idea that we evolved from lower animals was, you would get killed at one point for that. So it was really that bias. But then, obviously people like Darwin and other people came across, and then, people talking about brain in the late 1800s in France, people like Freud and Charcot and other people that were really looking at brain function at a really high level, Broca and Wernicke. These people started looking at it from a whole system. And then we started looking at it scientifically. But, even so, people used to believe that areas of the brain like the basal ganglia and the cerebellum only controlled motor function. We know now that that's completely wrong, that they play an integral role in cognitive ability and function and development. And it really starts with understanding the brain. People in biomedicine, they're really good with knowing the body, but honestly, in my experience, almost none of them know anything really about the brain. And people that know the brain, like psychologists or actually most psychologists don't know the brain very well, but, actually people that do know the brain don't really know that much about body and diet and nutrition. So this is where all these disconnects and the specialization that we have, I think, has really limited the knowledge of what's out there. So that the first question I ask most of my patients is, has anybody tried to explain what's happening in your brain or in your child's brain? And the answer is always no. Nobody's talking about this. Nobody's talking about what the problem actually is. They just look at autism. They say, well, it's autism. Oh, my child is constipated. Well, that's autism. That isn't a good enough answer for me. And that's what drives me, is to really understand that so we can actually come up with better answers. But it really starts with asking questions that other people don't ask.
And so just to conclude here, hopefully we can have you on again, because I initially started out with 30 questions. We reduced it down to 20 and then 18. And you've done such an amazing job answering these so far. But what we're talking about essentially was functional disconnection syndrome. And I'd like to know if you can just explain what that is connect the dot with what it is based on everything that we've been talking about so far. And maybe we can just leave it there for now. And if we can have you on some more, we can talk about how you guys went into developing treatments and stimulating brain development past some of the hindrances that occur.
Bottom line is, in the 90s, really, when I was first starting to look at this, all the research, we started to be able to image the brain in ways that we could never really look at it before functionally. And it started becoming aware that most issues with the brain, especially mental health issues, were not due to a lesion or a physical injury or chemical imbalance. It was really due to problems with functional connectivity of networks. And even now, that really is where it's all at, that these networks are not connecting, they're not communicating, and there's a disruption. And that happens primarily as a byproduct of abnormal development of the brain, not injury, not genetic mutations, but something's affecting the growth and development of the brain and the way that networks form and connect. When our brain is maturing, we start out with a lot of short-range connections in our brain and in our networks and forming local hubs. And then we need to lose those connections, some of them, and build long-range connections. And that ratio of short-range to long-range connections is very precise. And the bigger the brain is, the much more precise that balance is. What we've shown and what many other people have shown is that in something like autism, that ratio, there's an overproduction. There's too many short-range connections and there's not long-range connections. So even with the exact same amount of neurons and connections in the brain, if you alter that ratio by 10%, the impact it has on brain function and efficiency is huge. And that is a byproduct of development. As the brain matures, that's supposed to happen. But if the brain isn't maturing the way it's supposed to, it disrupts that ratio and the connections. And that is really where the real root problem is, in that functional connectivity problem. And that's what our lab and our research is primarily focused on.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. But Dr. Melillo, thank you so much for coming onto the show and taking the time to answer these questions here. We really appreciate your expertise and hope we can have you on to dive a little bit deeper into this. Who's talking about this to this depth?
Nobody. And that's the thing. And that's where, that's why all these, I have all these, I've published over 100 research papers. I have textbooks. I have 8 best-selling books. The most recent, Disconnected, it's out there. And obviously, if people go on my Instagram, we have all of this. I have 2 podcasts. One is the Melillo Method podcast, my own podcast, Everything Brain, where we talk about technical stuff like this. And then I have one that I do with my daughter called the Right Brain podcast. But there's a lot of resources out there where people can learn. But I'd love to come back. Thank you for having me. And, good luck.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
That was great.
Yeah.